on Bill C-32 and now answer a different question. Is this a bill that we should support? Should we try to kill the bill? There's already, I think, a domain name out there, killbillc32.ca, or should we try to fix the bill? And as I mentioned right off the top, I'm of the view that we ought to try to fix. Here's why. So the government says that this is balanced copyright, as you saw. I actually don't think that balance is the right word that I'd use here. I think that what they've tried to do in most areas is find a compromise. And you can describe that as an attempt to find balance. I don't know that they really, in all instances, are approaches that are balanced. But what they've tried to do in a lot of areas is actually try to find a compromise that they hope many Canadians can live with and say, this is how we can move forward on this. Now, I break up the bill that was introduced yesterday into three different kinds of reforms. The first are sector-specific reforms, reforms that are targeted against a particular individual or targeting a particular individual or group. And I should tell you that there is something in here for just about everybody. That's not a bad political strategy as these things go. You ensure that for just about anybody who sees themselves as a stakeholder in this copyright reform process, there is a provision in there, or provisions in there, that you can point to say, this one was for you. And so when we talk about performers looking for new rights, there are new rights there for performers. Photographers have been long looking for some reforms in terms of the rights they have around commissioned photographs. That reform is in there. Broadcasters have now for years argued for an ephemeral exception. Broadcasters have for a number of years now paid for the right to take songs on a CD and transfer them onto a hard drive. And so if they wanted to spin the songs essentially off of the hard drive, they had to pay for the right to take the songs off the CD, put it onto a hard drive, to try to drive home the point of how crazy this was. Chum Radio, back when they were Chum, in the market here in Ottawa, used to pay a couple of people to spin off CDs. They refused to pay the fee. They said, we'd rather employ a couple of people and just use simple CDs rather than use the kind of technology that's out there that would allow to run all of this off a hard drive. The government has acquiesced from a broadcaster perspective at long last, and actually gone ahead and created an exception for that, so that fee would no longer be applicable. There are provisions in there specifically targeted at creators. New exceptions, for example, for parody and satire, which a number of creators have noted they weren't protected if they were engaged in those kinds of works. There are now specific protections for parody and satire as fair dealing. There are some very clear exceptions in there for education. The biggest one by far is one that takes the fair dealing provisions, which at the moment, until this bill, were 5: research, private study, news reporting, criticism, and review, and now makes education one of those exceptions. This is enormous. There are other exceptions that are in there that are education specific, but frankly, I don't even know how important they will ultimately be, because with a full exception for education, this is a dramatic shift in the approach that we've seen. So there's big stuff there in that respect for education. There's stuff for those that want, I'm calling it here the enforcers, those that want to enforce against infringement online. So we keep hearing that Canada is a piracy haven. It is a myth. But nevertheless, there are a number of sites out there that are Canadian-based that are seen to facilitate infringement. There are now new provisions in there that will make it easier to go after those sites. If they are designed with infringement in mind, the law will say that is itself an infringement, and there are standards that set for that. And then there are consumer-related provisions as well. There were many Canadians jumping up and down with joy last night when they learned that recording television shows will now be legal in Canada. So there were many people out there just waiting to hear that because they just, it wasn't that they couldn't work their VCR. It was that they thought that this was illegal, and so they were concerned about breaking the law. So recording television shows will now be legal. In fact, it's even more than that. They're allowing for format shifting that will allow people to take music off of CDs, put it onto an iPod, make backup copies, a range of consumer-oriented things. But all of this, almost all of this, comes with one big caveat that you will hear about in just a moment. So there is something in there for just about everybody. That's the sector-specific stuff. There are also the provisions that I would argue are really compromise positions. And this is where it gets much tougher. It's relatively easy to give photographers an exception. There aren't that many groups that are against that, and so it's a kind of easy thing to do. The compromise stuff is tougher. And so on compromise, we get a number of things. First off, they try to deal with the issue of intermediary liability. What role for internet service providers in particular, or websites? Now, there were those that argued for, there's no real role at all. ISPs don't need to do much of anything. Deal with the individuals, deal with the rights holders. ISPs are nothing more than essentially a common carrier, a dumb pipe. They're just sending stuff. They stay out of it. There are others at the other end of the spectrum who said, no, not only should ISPs involve, they ought to be kicking subscribers off their systems based on allegations of infringement, what's known as 3 strikes and you're out. Or as the Block said in one press report today, they prefer 2 strikes and you're out. Apparently, 3 is too generous. So 2 times you allege infringement, and we ought to kick you off. And so some who argued at that end of the spectrum. Others talk about taking stuff down. The government has settled, I think, somewhere in the middle with what's known as a notice system. It's one actually that was proposed in the last 2 bills, and it's one in which a rights holder has the right to send a notification to an intermediary alleging that a subscriber or a user has infringed, and the ISP is required to then send that notification onto their subscriber. They don't reveal their personal information onto the rights holder, but it turns out providing that notification works pretty well. I think sometimes it goes to the parent of the kid who is alleged to have infringed, and the parent says, you did what? And so that activity stops. Sometimes it merely serves as an education mechanism where someone doesn't even realize that what they're doing was infringing, and suddenly they become aware of that now. And so in fact, the Entertainment Software Alliance of Canada did a study, and they found that about 70% of people who receive these notifications, as far as they can tell, didn't put the file back up on a file sharing system. Now that may not be strictly because of the notice, but it does highlight the fact that if you tell people rather than trying to kick them off, it can actually be reasonably effective. So pretty good balance on intermediary liability. Pretty good balance, not everyone agrees with me on this, but pretty good balance, I think, on fair dealing as well. So one of the big fights here, or the discussion points, was those that argued for a full, flexible approach for fair dealing, saying that those 5 categories were good, but you needed to have the ability to expand beyond them to other areas, and that we ought to make it more like a U.S. fair use provision, but still within the context of Canadian law, by saying it's open to add additional categories. There were then others at the other side of the spectrum who said that any exception is just theft, and we shouldn't have any new exceptions whatsoever. And so what the government has done is try to fall somewhere in the middle. They haven't gone fully flexible, but they have added exceptions. And I essentially mentioned a number of them earlier: education, parody, satire, time shifting, format shifting. There's even a YouTube exception in there for remix and mashup, where someone builds on another work for non-commercial purposes. That is now protected as well. So it's kind of interesting to see actual YouTube remix mashup type exception included there. So pretty good compromise. And then finally, a pretty good compromise on the damage awards that are possible in this context. And so a number of years ago, Canada created statutory damages so that a rights holder wouldn't have to actually prove what damages they suffered, but rather could rely on the statute. It talked about damages of up to $20,000 per infringement, which is why you hear about these potential for multi-million-dollar liability for a file sharing case. But this was created at a time where, frankly, no one even envisioned the possibility that you'd actually sue your customers and tell them that they owe millions and millions of dollars for all of this. It was really just thinking about large-scale commercial activity. Well, now the law, if this bill becomes law, actually will try to distinguish between commercial infringement and non-commercial infringement. Tough penalties for commercial infringement, reduced and capped penalties that are supposed to be proportionate, they talk about that in the language, for non-commercial. That's actually a pretty good compromise. Let's go after the people who we think we should be going after, not the others. So that's some of the compromise positions. The problem with this bill, so all this sounds actually pretty good. Now, I was surprised to find myself saying a lot of really good things about this legislation, but it was actually pretty good. The problem, but this is one really monster problem, is the no compromise issue. And there is one no compromise issue, and it has to do with anti-circumvention rules or digital locks, which in the view of many undermine just about all the gains that I just described. It's the one area where there is no compromise, and frankly, had there been one, I think this would be a bill really worth supporting. Now, anti-circumvention really dealing with digital locks, I've been amazed with the media coverage in the last 24 hours. The focus has been on this digital lock issue, and people actually seem to understand what a digital lock is, or at a minimum, the media is willing to talk about it, which I think is a really good thing. It turns, in this particular case, Canadian law into what I think is a Canadian DMCA. I think of this in terms of 3 layers of protection. Copyright provides protection, protects the work itself. The digital locks, whether digital rights management or technological protection measure, choose your acronym, provides technology that protects the work itself. That's the region coding on a DVD, that's the digital rights management on an electronic book, that's the copy control on a CD. This new legislation introduced yesterday provides legal protection for the technology itself, provides essentially a third layer. And so what it says is that any attempt to pick that digital lock, to circumvent that protection, is itself an infringement. And it says that in a way that it doesn't even matter why you were circumventing. It doesn't even matter why you were trying to get around that digital lock. The mere act of trying to pick the lock is itself an act of infringement. Now, this becomes a big problem because there are legitimate reasons why someone would want to pick that digital lock, why they would want to circumvent. Sometimes it's merely for access. So think, for example, of region coding in, say, multicultural communities who get DVDs from other parts of the world that are region coded to that other part of the world, designed to play on DVD players in Asia or in Europe or elsewhere. They bring it back to Canada and they won't play. Well, they have to circumvent here, not to try to copy the DVD, but rather simply to be able to watch it in the first place. So the approach the government has taken here is to say that any attempt to circumvent is itself an infringement, which ultimately has a big impact on all the new rights they just provided, as well as all of our existing rights. In a sense, the digital lock trumps everything. So it trumps research, where the research exception, which exists within the Copyright Act right now, you can't say, I circumvented this lock as part of my research, with the exception of a security research exception in the Act, because notwithstanding the fact that your intended use was legal, it's trumped by the rule itself. Digital lock prevails. So too with private study. The student that wants to use this for some private study purposes, already within the Act, private study is not an excuse or an exception anymore once there is a lock in place. So too, and I talked about this a lot with reporters yesterday, news reporting, criticism, and review. Think of the media that might want to do a media story using some audio or video that's under a digital lock. They want to use a snippet out of a DVD. Well, today they can do that because they would rely on the news reporting exception within fair dealing. But if there is a digital lock on that DVD, and there typically is, they can't do that anymore. And so even the basics, the ability to do it from a news reporting perspective is lost. The private copying levy. People pay a levy on blank CDs. This one just kind of blows my mind a little bit. Let's say you buy a copy-protected CD and you buy a blank CD on which you have paid a levy, the right to make that private copy. The Act says that if you try to circumvent that CD to make that backup copy on the CD that you've paid a levy on, that's still an act of infringement. You've paid twice. You've paid for the CD, you've paid for the blank DVD, and you're still labeled an infringer. In a situation where the lock trumps all. It trumps the consumer right. So I just said that you could make backup copies of the CD or of the DVD, let's say. The kids typically scratch them, or transfer formats, take the DVD and want to put it onto a video player so that it's portable. Well, it's true that they just offered all of that, but so long as the content itself is under a digital lock, you can't do any of those things anymore. So this is a pretty big problem. There's privacy issues. It trumps your privacy rights as well. It trumps those new education rights that I just described. Even trumps new library rights. To show you from an education and library perspective how pervasive the notion of digital locks are, there is a specific education provision in there that talks about distance learning and the ability to create lessons that are used in this distance learning context as an exception. It also says that you have to destroy those lessons. If you use this exception, you have to destroy those lessons 30 days after the course concludes. And it actually talks not just about the teachers, but the students as well. And so I asked about this yesterday at the lockup. I said, so is this back again? And the answer was, well, yes, but we've made it technology neutral, so it'll even apply to things like podcasts. So you mean I now have to destroy my podcast 30 days after the class ends? And the answer is, well, yeah. So that's where locks comes up there. So too with librarians. And so there's an exception in there that would allow librarians to provide articles that they would have typically provided in paper format in digital format, but only if that article self-destructs within 5 days. It's the Maxwell Smart provision. So you have to provide it to someone, but it has to self-destruct literally in 5 days. That's how pervasive locks are throughout this legislation. And it goes, as I said, to rights of access and all of these new rights as well. So that's the bad news, and as you can appreciate, it's pretty bad news if you're trying to strike a true balanced law. Now, the good news is I think this can be fixed, again, with compromise language. Sort of the basic starting point would simply be to say that circumvention is permitted if it's done for a lawful purpose. So someone that circumvents, say, a DVD because they want to burn 1,000 copies and sell it on a street corner, well, that's clearly infringement, and the law clearly ought to apply. But the parent that wants to circumvent that same DVD to make a backup copy so that it's not scratched and unplayable 3 months later is still permitted to do that, as the government itself has just said a parent ought to be able to do. That's a compromise, and in fact, it's a compromise that is compliant with international law. It still provides the protection that businesses who want to use digital rights management can use, and it maintains the balance. So we can do all of those sorts of things. So that's my Canadian copy fight story. Let me conclude just by noting that I think this last chapter might be the last chapter, at least for a while. Notwithstanding the fact that the government in this bill yesterday also put in a mandatory 5-year review where they intend to revisit this every 5 years, my guess is that our history is such that once we get a bill passed, if it is this bill, we won't revisit this issue in a serious way for reform for at least another 10 to 15 years. Now, when we think about the kind of numbers that Sheridan was just talking about, broadband at a certain speed by 2017, we're talking about not really changing anything till 2020, 2025. Think about what that technology will mean, what the internet will look like in 2020 and 2025, and recognize that the choices that we make in the Copyright Act today are going to be with us for a very long time. And so I would urge everyone here to recognize that there is, I think, both good and bad, and it is essential, I think, for all Canadians, no matter their perspective on this bill, to help us get it right by speaking out. Thanks very much for your attention.